What's up guys, and in today's video I'm going to be going through why my most valuable asset isn't cash but rather depth, thinking and navigation, and how I'm actively thinking about this and also solving this and scaling it into the future. So like always with these videos, the main mission is to show our builds raw and real, to show you the good, the bad, the ugly, what it is that I'm actively implementing in terms of mental models and how I'm scaling those mental models into the future. Also just to solve what hurts within businesses and organizations, to come in and be the chief problem solvers and ultimately just build back-end infrastructure off of that. And also just to call in visionaries, basically people aligned with what it is that we're actively striving for and solving for, and ultimately just to build a network of cool people doing cool things at the same time. So this one's a super fun one. I think, for different stages you go through different phases, and this one is just mainly just focusing on why I solely just believe right now that the most amount of, the biggest asset that I have right now isn't necessarily just chasing cash and just chasing all of this, but rather just building strategic leverage in terms of my depth thinking and also how I'm navigating certain situations. And I think right now in this specific time and phase, I think this is super important to just double down in terms of my thinking so that I can also just scale those up into the future. And why this is super important is because I used to think money was the most valuable resource, but I realized that in different stages and different phases you ultimately have different modes that are ultimately the biggest asset to you. And right now it's solely just building. Like building is one of the most valuable assets to me right now in terms of what it is that we're building inside Killer Chaos OS, to say, hey, right now the most valuable asset that I can have right now is my thinking and how I'm able to navigate certain situations, because once everything aligns, we ultimately then, just start playing the cash flow game. But right now, my thinking, articulation, and my ability to navigate ambiguity is the biggest asset that I can possibly have. And by making these daily videos, we just are able to, create more clarity within the way that I speak, the way I articulate myself, and also just the way that I am able to navigate ambiguity, which is super important because I think right now, the tool stack that we can be sharpening in this point in time is ultimately the way that I think about certain things, the way that I build mental models and reshape, how my brain works, like yesterday's video, because I know that if we just focus on this now, we only just scale it up into the future, which is super important because I think, right now in this phase in time, we just need to build and build mental models and feedback loops and all these things, because if we rush too much, just playing the cash flow game, like let's make so much cash, that ultimately does not serve us in the long term, but rather having that short-term sacrifice for long-term game and saying, hey, I want to make sure that I'm building leverage and that, my thinking, my, ability to navigate ambiguity and articulation are my biggest leverage points right now. Just being able to speak, I think, has been unmatched in just these daily videos. I've been so fortunate enough to, just 10x the way that I spoke, 20 videos ago till now, and that is ultimately something that I could not get if we were just, just not focusing on it and saying, hey, this phase ultimately isn't about money, but it's ultimately just about building depth. How can I possibly build the most amount of depth within these videos and also within myself in terms of what it is that we're building each and every single day and what we're shipping, and ultimately saying, hey, let's not optimize for cash in this specific phase in time, because cash flow is, it's good and it's good and it's going to serve us, when we're deploying in different, in different modes. But right now, let's just optimize for clarity, insight, and being able to think from first principles while the rest guess. So ultimately saying, hey, in this phase, one of the most important things that are going to, create leverage for us is the way that we get clarity and insights, and also just being able to think in first principles, because that is the foundation. Once we set the foundation right, then we can reason up from there to say, hey, let's think in first principles. What is the thing that is going to build us long term, like that is going to allow us to be sustainable in terms of what it is that we're doing long term? It's ultimately just going to be building the foundation, and this is at least how I find the foundation to be, to say, hey, I need to focus on the clarity and depth in terms of, understanding how we're building things and how we're failing fast, and also iterating, because this phase is our golden phase to get as much data points as we possibly can, because those data points are only just going to scale into the future. But, in order to get there, we ultimately just have to do, the dirty work, or stay in the trenches for long enough, and just constantly just perfect the product, which is one of the most important things. And saying, hey, cash flow will come after clear thinking, saying, hey, we will ultimately, reach the cash flow plays and all these things into the future. But right now, we need to make sure that we are, clearly thinking about how we're solving certain situations, how we're actively building right now, because how we're building right now and then into the future is going to be completely different. But ultimately understanding that, hey, if we want to deploy and make all these different plays into the future, we ultimately just need to build a solid foundation, because I would rather spend a long time building the solid foundation so that it doesn't crumble into the future, rather than just, scaling fast and then everything breaks. But I think this game is the game that will be, perfect, or right, most aligned to what it is that, we're striving for long term, and also just builds that depth, which is unmatched. And saying, hey, wealth follows clarity, not confusion, just getting as much clarity as we possibly can in terms of the product, what it is that we're building, and gathering those data points. I know that into the future we're only just gonna scale Killer Chaos OS, but right now it's mostly just, just dialing in and focusing on what we need to focus on in order to perfect, so that when we do get to the point where we're servicing this massive when we're doing all these big things, then we ultimately have taking the time to build that solid foundation that only acts as our leverage into the future. And saying, hey, this is the depth phase, just ultimately just focusing in on more depth, and saying, hey, every decision, every insight compounds forever. We just need to make sure that all the decisions that we're making, we just make sure that we understand that they compound, and how can we have the most possible, the most positive compounding effect from the decisions that we're making. Just basically documenting the decisions and the way that we're thinking right now is ultimately just, going to allow us to then understand into the future, and also articulate into the future how the team also, is able to build. Because logging those decisions and how we're thinking about things, I think is more valuable into the future, in terms of saying, hey, we just did XYZ, right? But basically logging each and every single decision, each and every insight, how we got to the, to the results, ultimately is going to compound. And how do we do that? We ultimately just have to build, and we have to make sure that we're doing it right, we're doing it each and every single day, and also as consistent as we possibly can. And saying, hey, thinking is ultimately going to be my weapon. Right now, I think the market, is noisy. There's a lot of information spreading out, and saying, hey, most people copy as well. They also, make sure that we also need to make sure that we understand that clarity is rare, and how do we strive for that clarity. And I think just going through this phase right now of saying, hey, we need to just basically take the time to not solely just focus on cash, just take the hit in the short term, and then ultimately just build into the future, is ultimately gonna, give us massive ROI into the future. Because right now, I solely just do believe that my biggest asset right now is ultimately the way that we're thinking, the way that we're documenting, the way that we're solving problems, because ultimately that is insights. All those insights, like I said in yesterday's videos, that's 100 insights, that's 100 videos, which leads to 100 insights, which leads to one refined system and one refined version of myself that will ultimately, be the best possible, scenario, or the best situation that we can possibly strive for. And this right now is why I'm training my brain to cut through the fog, ultimately, because when we get to that big picture vision, or where we want to get to, we need to make sure that, we are able to to make sure that, hey, we understand that this is the way that we need to think, and this is the way that we cut through fog, and saying, hey, let's not focus on what's trending, let's rather focus on what is true, and thinking in first principles, and saying, hey, we need to make sure that we're building through this phase, and just, deep in the trenches, just understanding what it is that we need to build and perfect in terms of the product, and also how we can create as much value as we possibly can in terms of building Killer Chaos OS. And through that, I know into the future, by taking that hit, we're only just going to get one step closer to the ultimate vision that we have for Killer Chaos OS. But it takes steps. I think, just rushing it wouldn't be the best thing to do right now. I think if we just take the time, perfect the product, and also just seek truth, and also just get that source of truth, we will be one step closer and saying, hey, I don't just want to be better at answers. I just don't want, to focus on getting better answers, but rather I want to be better at asking questions. I want to ask better questions. And I think these questions that, we have are ultimately going to guide us in terms of how we're going to build into the future. And solely just by asking better questions, I think we are going to reach a new level of awareness that is only going to scale Killer Chaos OS into this beast that we ultimately have for the vision. But ultimately, to get there, I just want to make sure that we're asking better questions and that we're going through this phase, because this phase is where we're going to gain the most amount of clarity and also understanding for how we're going to build into the future. And I don't mind, taking time on this. I don't mind, just not focusing solely on the cash flow plays, just mainly just building, because I know that we're building a solid foundation, and into the future that is only just going to compound. And how can we build the most positive compound effect right now? I think it are questions that we need to be asking, rather than just finding answers that fit the modes, or just are good to hear, but ultimately just asking better questions that ultimately allow us to reach a new level of understanding, so that into the future we can build better products and also just create as much value as we possibly can. And saying, hey, that's what builds category defining systems. One of the things that I have been thinking about a lot lately is basically, how can we build category defining systems? How can we build systems that define themselves and aren't rigid, in the sense that, hey, they are solely just built because they fall into a specific category, but how can those systems create their own categories simply through the value that they provide? And through that value, we know that we're going to get one step closer. And just simply just asking those questions, I believe, is going to give us that that competitive advantage that will ultimately just build these category defining systems that will ultimately act as ops intelligence brains for themselves, which I know into the future is going to be super important to just roll this out fully. But steps, small steps each and every single day, I think is ultimately going to get us a step closer. Like, by no far, like, we're still super far from this, but ultimately I know that these 100 days equals 100 new insights, which would equal to one refined machine and one refined self. I think is ultimately going to be the best possible leverage that we can create right now. And saying, hey, articulation is equal to leverage. And why that is because it's not enough to think deeply. It's also mandatory to also communicate simply as well through these videos. Just ultimately just making sure that, hey, even though we're thinking and we're doing all these things, let's speak, let's articulate how it is that we want to build Killer Chaos OS, and how it is that I want to make the abstract land, making the complex feel obvious, to say, hey, you're facing chaos, now let's explain it, because that's how deals close. That's how collaborators say yes, and that's how advisors lean in, because simply we're able to articulate, hey, this is how we want to build Killer Chaos OS, this is the vision that we have for it, and this is how we're actively striving for this each and every single day. Because if you can't say it clearly, then you don't understand it as deeply enough as you should, and you ultimately just need to be able to communicate it, because communication is probably one of the most important assets that we can possibly gain. And through this, I think these daily videos have given us a lot of insight, a lot of playbooks that we can formulate to just refine the machine each and every single day. But I think one of the most important things has solely just been building this moat, building the most valuable asset, which is the way that I think, the way that I've been able to articulate, and also just fail and fail fast. By no means I'm not an expert, I'm not anywhere near that, but ultimately I think just by speaking and just articulating, we get one step closer to the vision that we're gonna build. And it will be a cool story, even if we fall just slightly short. I think it would be a cool story to say, hey, we failed, but we tried. And I think that building the picture or building the vision for the future is ultimately what we want to do. And ultimately being a category defining system, building that, and being at the forefront of that, that is a one cool story to tell and super exciting to share one day. So I'm just gonna be keeping putting on the hitting the nail in the wall and constantly just building towards that and saying, hey, so now I'm obsessed with how I speak, how I write, and how I riff each and every single day. I am now just diving deep in terms of how it is that I'm articulating myself, sharing these videos, and also just saying, hey, I'm super obsessed now about the way that I'm speaking, the way that I'm articulating myself, because now I just want to build leverage in terms of my articulation, because that is only gonna just 10x into the future. And this is why ambiguity, navigating this ambiguity, also makes me dangerous, because most people freeze when the path isn't clear. Me, I want to come alive to say, hey, that's where I come alive. No clear roadmap, I'll just rather build it. If there's anything, and I think I said this on my Twitter yesterday or X, I was like, hey, if it's something difficult or something that is seems impossible, there's a reason why no one has done it. So why don't you just do it? Why don't I just do it? Like these videos, I saw Ryan Clark doing it, and shout out to him again, doing these 100-day videos, and I was like, hey, that's super cool. Why don't I just do it? And I just started day 1, day 2, day 3, etc., up until day 57. Here we are. And each and every single day, I think just having that mindset of, hey, the path's not clear, but I'm going to build it anyway, is how the builders that built these big companies like Apple and Microsoft and all these companies did it. And why not just steal a play out of their book, steal like an artist, and also say, hey, I don't know what's going to happen into the future, but we're going to build it anyways. And I think that level of conviction is only just going to drive Killer Chaos OS into the beast that we ultimately have this big picture vision for. And I'm super pumped and saying, hey, if it's uncertain, I use it as signal. If moving pieces are there, I basically synthesize it, ultimately saying, hey, we need to be able to, just be able to handle these ambiguous situations and say, hey, ambiguity forces you to slow down though, zoom out, and design the answer. So basically saying, hey, if things are unclear, we can zoom out, we can think about it, and then we can also decide what the answer is, and also ask questions as well, because the better questions we ask, the better we are able to just understand what it is that we need to be doing on a day-to-day basis, that ultimately scales Killer Chaos OS into the future that we want it to be. And saying, hey, that's how Killer Chaos OS is being shaped, not from uncertainty but from courage, that hey, we know what we want to do and we're going to build it anyways. We may fail, we may fall short, but we're going to build it anyways. And this is where depth and this is why this is the depth and leverage phase, saying, hey, this isn't the scale phase. I'm not looking to focus on scaling and just having 100 or 200 clients all in one place, but also just the refinement phase and saying, hey, I'm not playing checkers, I'm playing 3D chess blindfolded. And this depth compounds, it becomes leverage, and through this leverage, it also becomes the cash flows that is sustainable, defensible, and repeatable, which is one of the most important things, because I want to make sure that how we're building it right, and we're taking our time, no matter how slow it may feel. Slow growth is always the best possible growth, at least from my understanding. Like being slow and just taking time, you also ultimately just feel like you earn it a lot more. So saying, hey, we're gonna take the time to build Killer Chaos OS, we're gonna fail, but ultimately the path's not linear. We're not just gonna do XYZ, then this and this and that. It's ambiguous. There's gonna be a lot of things that we're gonna fail at, things that we're not gonna succeed at, and also not understand, but ultimately we're just gonna build anyway. And I think this level of conviction and clarity is ultimately just gonna build the big picture vision of what it is that we have for Chaos Killer OS, and also just ultimately for myself as well, to say, hey, I'm just gonna be a better leader. I'm gonna be failing a lot, but also ultimately I'm gonna raise my hand and say, hey, I'm gonna take it on the chin that we failed, we did not do what we needed to do, but hey, we tried anyways. And I think that is a far cooler story to tell one day. Say, hey, we built this, and this is the way that we were thinking about it. We locked out decisions, and this is how we were articulating it. And I think that into the future, this depth and clarity phase that we're going through and just taking time on is ultimately going to be our biggest leverage point and our competitive advantage as well. just building it slow, taking time, but also just perfecting it and building the solid foundation. So yeah, this is just my rambling on it. We're still gonna fail so many times, but we're also just gonna get one step closer through these videos. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a comment, follow me on X, LinkedIn, Instagram, and I will see you guys in the next video.